Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about biblical exegesis. I want to introduce what it is to you, the types of it, um, and show you how we're going to be using it as a tool to analyze the biblical text. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. Let's talk about the basics, what exegesis is. Exegesis is defined as the critical explanation or interpretation of a text, especially of Scripture. So let's break that down. Critical. Now, don't think criticizing or negative thoughts or anything like that. In this sense, critical means exercising or involving careful judgment or judicious evaluation. So it just means we're going to be analyzing, looking carefully at the text. Okay? And it's an explanation or interpretation. Right now, this just means we're going to be making the meaning of the text plain. Okay, and that part is very important. It's of a text. We're not explaining our beliefs or our opinions. We're explaining the text. Okay, so exegesis is just using really critical thinking skills, looking clearly at a text, trying to make its meaning plain, and primarily the meaning of the text, right? Not looking at our own opinions or beliefs, but making clear the meaning of the text. That's what exegesis seeks to do. Now, there are some difficulties with exegesis, right? We're a third party to the text. So when we're trying to figure out the meaning of it, we have to realize that we're not the author, we didn't write it, and we're not the original readers of the text either. So just as it's almost as if we're breaking into somebody else's mail. Okay, we don't know who the author was. What can we find out about the author? Who were the readers? Who were the people that the text was originally meant for? And what was their social or cultural and religious context? Where were they coming from, both the author and the reader? And why was the text written? Why has this particular piece been written? So these are all going to be questions that are gonna that we're gonna have to ask ourselves as we start looking at the biblical text. Now, there's going to be further difficulties with a gap, right? Because not only are we not the author or the readers, the original author or the original readers of the text, but there are further gaps that separate us from the text. Okay, the first of these is going to be the historical gap, right? In dealing with the Hebrew Bible, this is separated from us in history by several thousand years, at least 2,000 in many instances, and potentially even 3,000. So there's a huge historical gap that we really have to deal with and recognize when we're looking at this text. And that's also going to include a cultural gap, right? These were not people just like us with our same kind of mindset just a long time ago. Okay, they had a very different culture and a very different way of thinking, and we have to realize that. And that different way of thinking is going to be represented in a linguistic gap. As we talked about with the text being written in Hebrew, that doesn't just mean that we can substitute English words for Hebrew words all the time. Sometimes there are concepts in Hebrew that just don't translate to English. And so there's a linguistic gap there as well. And so these three gaps together, we have to recognize them in order to really approach the text well. Now, there's going to be some other considerations that we're going to have to take into account as well. First off, the text is the product of collective and historical growth. Okay, the text has grown over time from oral traditions to being written down to being canonized and made scripture. So we're going to have to recognize that. Next off, there are multiple and different versions of the same text. Okay, when we look back in history and archaeological finds, there are many different versions of the text, and we have to take these into account. And there's going to be types of exegesis, types of ways of looking at the text that are going to help us deal with that. And finally, the other thing that we really need to take into consideration is, are we reading through the lens of our tradition? Okay, now what do I mean by that? The lens of our tradition, we each have a place we're coming from, whether that's a Christian lens or a Jewish lens or a Muslim lens or an atheist lens. We all have a tradition of our own, and oftentimes we easily read a text through the lens of our own tradition. We analyze it and interpret it through that lens. Now, this is called eisegesis. Right? This is the opposite of exegesis. Eisegesis means that we're reading our own ideas into the text instead of getting meaning out of it. Now, think of this like coffee, okay? The more sugar and the more cream you put into coffee, the less it tastes like coffee. Okay, and it's the same with the text. The more we read our own ideas into a text, the less we're letting the text speak for itself, the less the text is going to actually preserve the characteristics that make it something different, something unique. Okay, so if the text is like coffee, we want it black, right? We don't want to be reading our own ideas and opinions into the text. We want the full experience, the full flavor of the text. Now, what we also have to realize with exegesis, as we're thinking critically about a text and trying to make the meaning of it clear, we have to realize too that we're not looking for the meaning of the text, right? There are going to be different types of exegesis that are going to uncover different meanings. Okay, so we're not trying to master the text and find the one meaning, what the text means. So instead of thinking of mastering the text, thinking about it as entering into it. Okay, we're going into the text and kind of searching for these meanings. Okay, so we're trying to leave everything about our own tradition and our own lens, leave it behind and just go into the text. Now, so let's talk about these kinds of exegesis. Okay, all these circles that you see are different types of exegesis. These are different tools that we can use to really understand the text. And like I said before, these different kinds of exegesis are going to uncover different kinds of meaning. And when we put them all together, we start to have a fuller picture of the text and a fuller picture of what the text means. So, let me go back real quick. I'm sorry. I know this is sideways at the moment, but the iceberg is a very good illustration of just how these types of exegesis work, because there are certain types of exegesis that deal very well with, or that look at the text as far as the words on the page, okay? And you can think of that as the types of exegesis, those three circles that are above the water, off to the right. Okay, those are going to be looking at like kind of the words at the page, like what we can see, what the text is saying, like right there in front of us. And then there's those other four circles that are underwater, and that's kind of like what's behind the text, what's underwater, what's beneath it. Okay, so let's look first at what's above the water here. Okay, there's social and historical criticism, form criticism, and grammatical criticism. So let's take this first one, form criticism. This is how the text communicates. Okay, because what form criticism is going to say is that it's not just what a text says that gives it its meaning, but it's how it says it. How a text communicates is going to shape the meaning. Okay, so questions that are going to come up with form criticism are: what is the literary form or genre of the whole work and the particular text? Now, we're going to be dealing a little more with form criticism later on in this week's lessons, but think about how important it is to take into consideration the genre of a work, right? You read something differently if it is a fairy tale than if it is a newspaper article, than if it's IKEA furniture instructions, right? All those are different genres, and we know how to respond to those differently. Another question is, does the text follow or diverge from the usual expectations for this genre? For example, if it's a fairy tale, what if it doesn't end with "and they lived happily ever after," right? That would be diverging from our expectations for the genre, right? And that divergence would be important because it would mean somebody is working within a certain form, a certain way of presenting an idea, and yet they're changing it. And likely when somebody changes a form, they're doing it on purpose to convey a meaning. So we have to look at if somebody steps outside of the expectations for a certain genre. Another question is, what is the normal purpose or goal of this genre? So thinking about what's the purpose of a fairy tale? What is the purpose of assembly instructions? What's the purpose of a newspaper article or the purpose of an editorial? And how does that purpose shape our understanding of the text? And finally, in what social context would texts of this genre have been used? Form criticism looks and says, well, okay, this is a hymn, for example, an Haymn, a hymn, and says, well, would they use this in religious services or so on? So think about the kinds of social context that surround genres. So, for example, beyond the hymn and singing that in religious services, we also have the idea of sermons. Sermons, for example, would also be used in a religious service, but in a different way, right? This is a genre that not everybody participates in usually, but is usually spoken to a group of people in the same way as political speeches would be used. So there's always a social context that surrounds the genre. Another example would be fairy tales that are usually read to children, right? So there's a social context that surrounds the genre. So that has to be taken into account as well in trying to understand how we are supposed to read the text and trying to have the same ears and eyes as those first readers would have had. Now let's move on to grammatical criticism. This is going to be looking at what and how words are used. So first question, does a term appear to be used in the same way in different passages? Okay, so this is going to be looking at words, okay, and understanding how the words that are in a text help us to understand the text. Okay, so does a certain term or a certain word appear to be used in the same way in different passages? So say you have the word spirit in several passages. Is it used in the same way? Is it used in different ways? How broad of a meaning does it have? So would a word have a technical meaning, or does it have nuances? Is this a word that can only mean one thing? You know, like think of the word crayon. Like we all would probably say that has a technical meaning. It refers to that little bit of colored wax. So that's a technical meaning. Or are there nuances? There are lots of words in English that you can think of, for example, that have nuances, that have shades of meaning. Another question we would have is, in what types of literature does this word show up, or in what type of literature does it show up? So think of words like magic. Are there types of literature that that word shows up in? Are there types of literature that the word sincerely shows up in? For example, letters, when you would sign sincerely and then your name. So does the word also have literal or metaphorical meanings, right? So for example, the word mountain. The word mountain could be both literal and metaphorical. And there's some words such as, like I said before, crayon, that don't have so much of a metaphorical meaning in English. So when we're looking back at the Hebrew text, we have to ask ourselves, is this word being used in a literal way or in a metaphorical way? And finally, does the term or word provide a key to understanding the larger text? There's sometimes in the biblical text when a certain word is very pivotal to understanding the larger picture of the text and what's going on in the text. And understanding that one word could be incredibly important. Now, we're always going to want to understand that one word in the larger context, but it's going to be very important to take these words into consideration. Again, remember that we have that linguistic gap that's separating us from the text and providing that gap there that we kind of have to bridge. And by studying these words and how they're used and what they mean, we can somewhat narrow that gap or start to lessen it. Finally, in the text, we have the social or historical criticism. Right, this is the history in the text. Right, in other words, this is the history that we can find being told in the text. Right, so whose history is being described? You know, when we read accounts of Israel in the Old Testament, Is this the northern kingdom's history? Is this the southern kingdom's history? Is this King David's history? Is this King Saul's history? Whose history is being described is a very good place to start. The next question we could ask ourselves is, are what events are seen as important? When we retell our histories, we don't tell everything. We pick certain events that we see as important, certain events that we think are important to know leading up to the point we want to make. Okay, so if I were to tell my own autobiography, there would be certain points I would include. I probably wouldn't include what I had to eat or what grades I made in certain classes, because I wouldn't see those as important. So when we start thinking about the history in the text, what events is the author pointing out as important to us? Next question would be, who and what are talked about in the text? Okay, this is again just a broad question, but an important question, right? Who and what are talked about? Who and what are important to the author to be telling us about? Another question is, are there outside works that can give us another perspective? So, for example, when we look at, say, the conquests of Israel, or Israel's time in Egypt, are there any outside sources from any of those other cultures that we can look to that would give us another perspective on what's happening, right? So this is kind of comparative. We're comparing what the biblical text says with what, say, an Akkadian or Babylonian or an Egyptian text says about this event. And how does that shape how we see it? How reliable is this account that's in the text, right? When we're doing that comparative work, how reliable is the account that's given in the biblical text? Is it trying to be an historically accurate depiction, or is it have some greater cause in it? So that's another question that we're going to need to consider, is if it's a reliable account. And finally, if the story claims to be historical, what really happened, right? And that's going to tie into the reliability of the account. So this is all falling under the social and historical criticism, right? The history in the text. Now, the social historical criticism falls within a broader category just called the historical criticism, right? And historical criticism is made up not just of social historical criticism, but also of compositional history. So whereas the social historical criticism looks at the history in the text, the compositional history or compositional criticism looks at the history behind the text, right? How the text came to be. Okay, so for example, the first question we have in compositional history is the attributed author the actual author, or is the work pseudepigraphic? Now that's a big fancy word for meaning that the author is assuming a different name. Okay, now this was a common practice in the ancient world, and wasn't seen so much as we would see it today as being false. Okay, to assume somebody else's name would be to give the work a certain sense of validity, and to kind of attribute your work to somebody else in a positive way. Okay, so is the attributed author the actual author, or are they writing on somebody else's behalf? Right. Another question we would have is, what do we know about the author and the place of his, her, their work and life activity? Okay, what can we know about the person who wrote it? Because that might shape a lot of what we know about the text, or how we can interpret the text. What their own biases are, what their own opinions are, whether they would be sentimental to a certain king, or whether they would speak negatively of that king because of their own life's work and where they grew up, and the kind of culture they were in. Also, what tendencies and interests of the writer and his time influenced the work, its shape, and its content. Right? Again, this is the same thing of trying to find out something about the author, because the more we can know about the author, the more we can know about the text. Right? And this applies even today. Think about Moby Dick and Herman Melville, or Charles Dickens and the works that he wrote. The more we can find out about the author and the world they grew up in, and the world that they lived in, and their own life's work and activities, the more we know about the text and the more insight we can have into why they wrote what they did. Uh, Another bigger question, like stepping back even further from just the author, is we can ask ourselves, what was life like for the common people, right? Not just the ruling elites. A lot of times history gets told as, one king did this and then the next king did that. But what was the life like for the common people, right? That's going to give us a fuller picture of the context that the author was writing in. Also, when, where, and under what circumstances was the work written? We'll see in certain works just how much, that has influenced what was written. For example, is Israel under attack? Or is Israel in exile? If you are in your home and comfortable, you're going to write one way. If you're feeling like you're being attacked, you're going to write a different way. And if you feel like you've been exiled from your home, you're most likely going to write a different way still and have a different perspective. And finally, who and where were the original recipients? So remember when we said that this is like, when we read the biblical text, it's like going through somebody else's mail. This compositional history is trying to get us to ask about that original author and about that original audience. And in that way, we can find out more about the text. So, let's move on to more of this under the surface types of exegesis. The next one's called textual criticism. And this is the attempt to identify and account for copying errors. Okay. There are multiple times in the biblical text when we look at the sources that have been found through archaeology and just other sources of biblical text we have, there are multiple times when there are variations in the text. And textual criticism sees these variations and asks critical questions about them, right? And seeks to analyze them and figure out why these variations exist. So textual criticism starts out with asking, are there any variant readings in the ancient manuscripts? Are there some manuscripts that say one thing and some manuscripts that say another? And where they find these variations, where they find these variant readings, is where textual criticism is going to focus its attention. Because the next question it's going to ask is, are the variations the result of unintentional or intentional change? Right? Did a scribe just make a mistake when copying the text or when writing down the text? In changing one letter or in putting in a different vowel? Or is this a greater intentional change, right? Was the meaning changed? Or a word changed on purpose, right? And this gets us into our next question. Are the variants negligible or significant, right? Is the change made just something that doesn't matter and we can easily just pass over it? Is it unimportant, the variation that we see in the text? Or is it significant, right? Has the meaning been changed in a significant way, either by this unintentional or intentional change? Right, and obviously an intentional change where we see a significant change of meaning is going to be really important to look at. And the next question is, how do the literary or historical context help explain the variant readings, right? If this text has been passed down and we have these different context or these different readings of a text, right? Is it because of changes that have been made because of those different settings? Remember when we were talking about a text being written from one perspective, if you're safe in your home, if you're being attacked, or if you're in exile. In this case with textual criticism, we could maybe look at the text and say, here we have these variations in the readings. Is it possibly a result of these different kinds of historical contexts? And then finally, what textual criticism wants to get down to is, what was the original wording? Or is there at least a preferred reading? If we can't get to the original wording, can we at least make an educated guess at the preferred reading of a text? Can we say this variation is the one that we should probably follow, and as opposed to this other reading, which was likely the result of unintentional change? or a significant change, but a change that came much later. And we can say this earlier reading of the text is the preferred reading. Okay, that's what textual criticism tries to get down to, is that original wording or preferred reading. Now they're going to have two methodological preferences, right? Two kind of keys or guides in textual criticism when they approach a text, right? And the first preference is they're going to prefer more difficult readings, right? Because they see editors as coming along and throughout history and smoothing out some of these difficulties, right? It's almost like if you make your bed and you come along and you smooth out the sheets, right? You want it to look nice. They're going to say editors have come along and wanted to do the same thing to the text, smooth out those difficulties, right? So what they see as the difficult reading, they see that as the older reading, right? That hasn't yet been smoothed out. And in seemingly a contradictory term, but not quite, they're also going to prefer shorter versions, right? They're going to see editors as coming along and elaborating on stories, right? So editors are also going to, textual critics are going to prefer shorter versions of a text. So those two methodological preferences are more difficult readings and the shorter versions. They're going to see these as the older, more possibly original wording, or at least the preferred reading. Okay. Now next we get down to redaction criticism, right? We were talking about editors, and redaction is pretty much a fancy word for editing. And what redaction criticism is going to look at is it's going to emphasize that editorial history and the text as a whole, because they're going to look at how this text has been edited along the way, and what final product the editor has ended up with, right? So the redactor or the redaction critic is going to ask what sources are used. You know, is the from which places, from which traditions is the editor pulling from? What sources are they using? Are they using sources from other cultures even? Or are they using sources native to Israel? How are they put together? Right? How are these different texts all assembled? Right? Have they been smoothed out? Another question is, how did the author's life circumstances affect the shaping of the text? And how has the author or redactor used sources in shaping the text? Furthermore, what particular views or theological emphases does the author show? And what final meaning is thereby communicated? Okay, when we think about redaction criticism, we could even possibly think about looking at the text as if it were a rock layer. You know, the side of a mountain where you can see the different stratifications of rock. You can see the different layers of sediment that have been laid one on top of another for like hundreds and thousands and millions of years, right? The only difference is with the biblical text, this is an intentional move, right? So the redactor, the redaction critic, is going to come in and look at these different layers and want to know why they've been put together this way, right? And what do these layers represent? And they're going to look primarily, though, at not just each of these layers and what each of these layers represents, but they're going to look at the text as a whole. What does this whole picture finally look like, right? This text has been edited a certain way to convey a certain meaning. And what is that overall meaning that has been achieved by bringing all these different pieces together? So they're going to be looking at the sources, how they're put together, the background of the author and the redactor, and why that text has been shaped that certain way, and what views then are the result of that shaping. What does that final shape look like, and what does that mean? And finally, we get down to tradition and source criticism, right? This is looking into the building blocks of the biblical text. So if we think about the redactor, is looking at those different layers and seeing them all as a whole, and seeing all those different pieces as being put together, and then saying, what does this whole mean? The tradition or source critic is going to say, but what does each one of those particular layers mean? right? Let me look at these building blocks of the biblical text, right? So they're going to ask, somewhat like the redactor critic, does the text have any underlying source or sources, right? What traditions are associated with those sources, right? Is this one source from a priestly tradition? Is this other source from a tradition that was in exile? Like, what sources are there? We can see, and what traditions do those represent? For example, when you look at layers of sediment, it's asking what the story is behind that layer. Was there a great fire that produced this layer in the rock? Was there a lot of rainfall this year that produced this layer in the rock, right? So what stories can we find behind these different sources when we look at these different layers in the text? What stories and traditions are associated with those? If there is more than one source, which version was used? Right. This is getting us back into one of our earlier forms of criticism. What does the use of one source instead of another tell us? How do the variant versions relate to each other? Is one earlier. Notice that a lot of these types of biblical criticism do overlap, and they ask similar questions. They just have a different emphasis, a different goal in the end. Next to last, what do the sources actually say and mean in their original context? Okay, remember, we're looking at those different layers of rock and asking what are the stories and the traditions associated with that source, with that layer, right? We're asking now, what is this bit of the biblical text, right? What is this one source that's being used? What did that mean in its original context? And finally, how are the sources used in the later text, right? How are these sources coming together? And like the redaction critic, how are these sources being used in this new context, right? So how is the meaning of these building blocks changed a little bit? What new color or shape have they taken in this new context that they've been set in? So these are all the types of exegesis that you'll need to get familiar with these, because these are great tools that you'll need to make use of when you start reading the biblical text and analyzing it to see what sources are being used, what the author was like, what the readers were like. Because the more that we can answer these questions that exegesis asks of us, the less that we'll be doing eisegesis, the less that we'll be relying on our own opinions and beliefs to interpret a text, because we'll be letting the text speak for itself, right? Remember, it's like that piece of mail that we're opening up. Instead of just coming to it and having all these assumptions, right, we will have found out something about the original author. We will have found out something about the recipient. We will have found out why the author wrote a certain way. What was the background that made them have certain perspectives? Were they quoting any books? Were they quoting songs? Were they making reference to certain movies? Things like that. Now, obviously, just using that as a metaphor for these biblical texts. But it's a good way of thinking about it, in the sense of wondering what these influences were, wondering what the layers of the text are. Think about if you were given a collage, right? We're looking at where all of this came from and what it all means now that it's put together a certain way. So these are the types of exegesis. Become familiar with them, because they're going to help you read the text in a critical way. They're going to help you to critically examine and interpret the text. And it's going to keep us from doing eisegesis, keep us from reading our own thoughts onto the text, to where the text can no longer speak for itself, and when the text no longer has its own distinct character. We want to hear the text and hear what the text has to say. And exegesis is the tool and the set of tools we use in order to do that.